Thank you very much. At Chief Outsiders, we're a group of 70 ex-chief marketing officers, all of whom were at major companies and often at startups like I was. And we work on some of the most interesting marketing problems that are out there. What I want to take you through today are some lessons that I've learned over the years. They're going to look pretty simple, but the stories I'm going to tell you behind them are going to explain why they're not. So the first reason that CMOs matter is because customers matter. And what I've learned over the years is that many organizations tend to drift from their understanding of the customer. They will describe the customer very superficially and generically. So they'll describe them as, say, 25 to 35, living in the middle of the country. That's not a person. That's just a generic description. And I'll give you a story that'll kind of amplify this, because the role of the chief marketing officer is really to make the customer real and to make their needs real to the company, which gets you to the purpose of the company, as the other two speakers have mentioned. So when I arrived at Levi's, I was the head of marketing for the Dockers business. Dockers was the largest men's apparel brand in the United States. And when I started asking people about Dockers, they described the consumer as an overweight, and that's putting it nicely from what they actually said, overweight white guy in the middle of the country. And they talked in the ad campaign about how he was a lovable loser. And I was not the Dockers consumer. I had never owned, tried on, or even touched a pair of Dockers when I took the job. And yet I knew that you weren't going to make good marketing if you talked about your customer with so little respect. And so I had to do a whole culture change at Levi's. I started with the marketing department. We talked about the consumer. We talked about what they were really like. We acknowledged that they probably weren't our friends in San Francisco, but that didn't mean that they weren't great people. And so through developing this new attitude in marketing, through doing some primary research, we started to make this customer real to the rest of the organization. And we also became the cheerleader for this customer. And we moved the way that we talked about the customer at Levi's from this derision into a very positive focus. What happened also during that time is we went from a brand that was in a pretty steady decline into a brand that actually drove so much growth that it grew the entire khakis category. And so just that focus on the customer, that change in attitude, was what it really took to make that change. So the chief marketing officer has to be the biggest proponent and the biggest voice of the customer. Sorry, I'm progressing slides the other way. The other reason that the chief marketing officer matters is because the offering really matters. So once again, it sounds pretty simple. What company is going to make a product that the consumer doesn't want or that the customer doesn't want? Well, lots of them. Lots of companies get very self-focused, and what they end up doing is focusing on offering something that the consumer isn't that excited about. And if you're a good chief marketing officer, you really understand the customer, you really understand what they need, and you fight for it. So the example I'll give you here was when I was at Kmart. It was 2008, and we had just gotten a new CEO. He had been the head of operations, been promoted from EVP of operations to interim CEO. First thing he wanted to do was get rid of layaway. The operators hated layaway. The way layaway works is you go in, you pay a little bit of money for an item, the store puts it in the back room and hangs on to it. You come back every couple of weeks, you pay a little bit more. By the time you pay it off, you get your item back. So the store had to store all of this stuff, and oftentimes the customer would stop paying and they'd have to put the stuff back on the shelf. So it was a lot of trouble for the store. However, it was really important for our customer. So no other chain offered this option. Layaway had been very popular back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. By 2008, everybody else had gotten rid of it. Walmart had gotten rid of it. Target had gotten rid of it. They were using that space for online sales. The head of credit cards and I went to the CEO and we said, we got to keep layaway. Layaway is something, so many of our customers don't qualify for a credit card. This is the only way that they can finance Christmas for their families. And it took a long time and a lot of passion and a lot of data to convince him that we should keep it. Well, what happened in 2008 was we had the Great Recession. And as a result of layaway at Kmart's same-store sales were up when everybody else was down. Walmart was down, Target was down. Kmart actually won at Christmas. And by the next year, Walmart, Target, Sears, all of those folks had layaway. And they had realized that this was something that actually was important to the consumer. So that's just one example of how, I've got a lot of them, about how as a chief marketing officer, you really have to fight for the product offering to make sure it really meets the needs of the customer. The next thing I want to talk about is impact. So I started marketing before Al Gore invented the internet. And when I first started, we had to figure out if marketing was working, sort of backing into it from a causal standpoint. You'd look at things like brand tracker or market share or brand awareness. Now we have the internet, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful to be able to look and say, okay, this ad is getting me, this ROAS so for every dollar I'm spending, I'm making this much money. It's great that you can do that, but it also can trick you into believing that something is either good or bad when it isn't. So the story here is from when I was at Sunrun. Now, Sunrun is a public company now. I joined when I was employee 65, and we sold solar leasing. So if a person wanted a solar system on their house and they couldn't afford it, which most people can't, they cost $35,000 to $50,000. We would put one on their roof for them. They would pay us a monthly fee over the next 20 years, and that fee would be designed to be lower than their electric bill. And so they would have clean power. They'd save money on their electricity. They'd know their bill was never going up. And so it was a really, really good deal. However, people were very skeptical about solar companies. I did an attitude and usage study that showed 65% of people agreed with the statement, most solar companies are fly-by-night and won't be around for long. So we went to business through solar installers. We didn't actually have a force who went and knocked on doors and met with customers. So there were a lot of solar installation companies that would go in, they'd try and sell in a solar system. If the customer wouldn't pay cash, they'd bring up Sunrun. And what they were finding was, when they started describing the product and said, yeah, it's a monthly bill, it's lower than your electric bill, the customer was always like, what's the catch? What's the catch? It's too good to be true, because of this skepticism. So we decided in certain markets we would try broad reach media, television, outdoor, super hard to measure, but something that we felt like could really help. And what we found was we had hoped that we would get enough new leads coming into the Sunrun to pay for the TV. We didn't. And so at the very beginning, I was like, gosh, I'm not really sure there's a way this is going to work. But I was hearing from the solar installers that it was working. So I went back, I thought about it some more, and I went back in and I studied, and I had to personally dig through all the Salesforce data, customer by customer, to do this. I studied not only how many leads we were driving, but also what changed in the close rates. So when a solar installer was sitting with a customer and they presented Sunrun, did the customer say yes? And what we found was the television had actually increased the close rates dramatically versus control markets. And so what we were doing was we were giving credibility to this company, and it wasn't the first time the consumer was hearing about it, and they had a lot more trust, and they were a lot more likely to believe. And when we looked at it that way, the television was wildly successful, and definitely something that we should continue. And Sunrun advertises on TV to this day. And Sunrun is doing extremely well now as a public company. So that's just one example of how you got to make sure that you're measuring the right thing, and that you're not just looking at what's obvious to look at. So the next lesson, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to go kind of fast here. CMOs matter because the unexpected matters. So I work with a lot of companies, and what I'm seeing is there's some companies that are thriving during COVID-19, and it's because they were really smart about what they did early. So first of all, They did a lot of work to protect their customers and to protect their employees. And that was very important to people. People were very interested in knowing that a company was taking care of its employees. They also made the hard cuts early. So Airbnb cut 25% of their workforce. They did that because they didn't want to have to keep cutting, and they haven't had to. So that's one example of how they do that. But what I've seen actually is that the smart companies really adjusted where they could. So I have a company who's a client who makes eyewear. They make sunglasses and glasses. And they saw an opportunity, because they had the manufacturing capability, to pivot and start making protective eyewear for healthcare workers. They got a huge government contract to do that, and they're actually thriving right now, when you would think that a sunglass company would probably not be doing very well. They're actually super busy. And then I've also seen companies, who were just lucky. I have a company that sells luxury outdoor furniture, and because there's so many people at home right now, and they're not eating out and they're not traveling, they're spending money on outdoor furniture. So the companies that I've seen either made good early moves, adjusted their offering, adjusted their messaging, as the other speakers talked about, and really just zeroed in on really who the audience is that can still buy their product, and making sure that they have an offering for their product. So that was pretty fast, but I will just say, I think that in conclusion, CMOs who make a difference, they provide a vision for the company. They make the customer real. They make what the customer needs real. And they measure, but they measure in the right way. And then they're always ready to adapt to what the new challenges are. And they're thinking about that all the time. Thank you very much.